I'm Amy Ortiz with ImpactAlpha. I'm our editorial director and I lead our climate coverage. Some of you may have been here for my colleague David Banks' session right before this one on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I am very excited to be kicking off this critical discussion we're going to have over the next few days. The theme of this year's SOCAP is catalyzing systems change, and I can think of no more important system than our climate, right, which is actually made up of many smaller interconnected systems that govern our waters and oceans and air and soil, and together regulate the temperature of the planet that allows life to thrive. So this is a very important discussion, and we're going to talk about what it means to invest for systems change in the climate space. So first, we wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. First of all, who's been impacted by a severe weather event recently? Yeah, a lot of us. And then can we get a show of hands of who is in the room? So how many investors are in the room? Okay. NGOs? Okay, lots. Entrepreneurs? Media? Okay, and then other category, I'm sure there are some out there.
Diana has her own category.
Oh, right. So let me jump right in and introduce our amazing set of panelists here. They're all systems thinkers, and they thought long and hard about this track, and they've helped curate all of the sessions that you'll be going to over the next few days. So I'll start with Laura Ortiz. She is the founder of SVX Mexico and Regenera Ventures, which is a fund to, it's a fund for rural Mexico's regenerative transition. Laura is a champion of regenerative culture, biodiversity, and transformative impact investing. And I might add, she's also an official agent of impact. And her mission is to ensure that capital serves life instead of governing it. I'm going to skip down to the end to Tom Chi, who is the founding partner at One Ventures, which is a VC firm here in the Bay Area, with a mission to accelerate a future where humanity becomes a net positive to nature. He's also an astrophysicist. I think you had your first job as an astrophysicist at age 15 for the Harvard Smithsonian Observatory. And he's also a founding member of Google X, among many other achievements, and you can read all of the longer bios online. And At One has raised about $500 million to date for climate investment. And in the middle, we have Gilad Goren. He's been leading social ventures for 15 years, most recently and presently as executive director of the Nature Tech Collective, which is a nonprofit membership organization, sector intelligence unit, which means research, and a venture studio helping to propel humanity towards effective coexistence with the rest of nature. So the collective has about 120 members and works on regenerative agriculture, biodiversity, conservation, and green supply chains. So Gilad lives in Portugal, but he's here today direct from Cali, Colombia, where the COP16 biodiversity conference is taking place. So eager to hear about that. So as you can see, there's kind of a theme here. They're all working to transform economic systems to be in harmony with the planet and nature and to serve people instead of profits. So thank you all for being here. This is the opening track, so let's set the stage for the next few days. As Christina Figueres said this morning, we're doing great, but we're also doing terrible. And every time I write a climate story, I kind of grapple with that same thing. So how are we doing as a field when it comes to deploying climate capital? Why don't we start with Tom?
I mean, that is a pretty good summary. It's like great in that there's more capital in it than there was, 20 years ago. A little bit less than there was 2 years ago, but not terrible in the grand scheme of things. Like altogether improving the amount of capital and energy going in the space. But it's also correct that we're doing terrible. If you look at the way that the capital is allocated, then, like more than half of it went to mobility of small vehicles. And that's about 6% of the global emission mix. So if you're spending like 53% of the total capital invested from venture capital is going into cars and light trucks, and that's only 6% of the mix, you're over-indexing that by 10x. And it means that there's a bunch of things that you're under-indexing by 2, 3, 4, 5x. So in those areas, we're maybe not doing so good.
Gilad?
Yeah, so I represent the world of nature, which is kind of wild if you think of it, but there's sort of a split for some reason. When people say climate, they're often talking about carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, and then nature's like everything else. And part of our mission is to bring us back to the planetary boundaries, which includes greenhouse gas emissions. And as Tom was saying, if you look at the planetary boundaries, the area of greenhouse gas emissions, which isn't actually the most breached of the 9, actually has the most funding going into it. And in reality, as you said, there's a bit of a misalignment. And generally speaking, our theory is that this isn't a tech problem in general, it's a human coordination problem. So we just need to realign, and then boom, it's gonna like magic work. In terms of funding, we recently launched the 2024 Nature Tech report, actually in Cali. And in that report, we're showing that it's $2 billion of funds into nature tech startups, which is like 6 times the amount as of 2020, but I mean, it's still super small. So there's a ways to go.
Yeah, so first of all, it's very humbling to have Christiana in the audience. This is amazing. I really admire your work, and you have definitely inspired me. Thank you so much, and the world. But also, Tom has been one of my teachers, and it's amazing to be here. Thank you, Michelle, for this opportunity, and thank you, SOCAP, because the first SOCAP that I came to was 2014, which I think it was your first SOCAP as well, and I think it has really grown and evolved, and I'm really happy to be part of this. So in terms of what they were just mentioning, there's a graph that is really representing what the IPCC is really recommending and what is underfunded and what is overfunded. Just as Tom mentioned, electromobility is overvalued and it is overfunded. All the tech-based solutions are very overfunded because they come from the benchmark of venture capital. What has been really underfunded, as Gilad mentioned, is of course nature, because what we're lacking, I think, my hypothesis, is ecological intelligence, EI. We need to value EI more than we do AI, because that's a fake one. It's one of the fake ones. Like the real ecological intelligence is what Gilad is pointing towards, the 9 planetary boundaries, the limits. And so who here has recently put their hands in the soil? And who has ever been overworked to the point of breakdown? So whatever we're doing to the soil and the ecosystems, we're doing to ourselves and vice versa. But also when we heal those ecosystems, we heal ourselves. But one of the things that soil teaches us is that there's limits, even if the Excel doesn't have them. And so the Excel spreadsheet is a cell because we're definitely trapped in that mindset. We need to liberate our minds and our funding from the Excel. And we need to really, really learn what the ground and the soil, which is the most generous bank in the history of humanity, is ever nourishing, and it is distributed by design instead of accumulative. And so I think it's not only what we're not funding, it is the how we're funding it. We're still overfunding with debt, And compound interest is one of the poisons of humanity. Just ask any third world country what compound interest is. It is the enemy. And so if we keep using a broken finance system to put more debt to the third world, I mean, whatever you call it, global south, you know, that's the problem. Now we're doing climate finance, and most climate finance is in debt. And so we're putting more debt towards the already indebted countries, companies, and people. And so I think it's not only how we're doing in terms of what themes are underfunded or overfunded, it is the how, and it is the why. Like, if we still are using capital as like being the purpose of its everlasting growth and over reproduction, or if it is to liberate humanity's potential. But if we want to liberate humanity's potential, we need to liberate from the Excel spreadsheet.
Oh, amazing. Actually, if I could say something to build on that really quickly, it's like we had multiple phases of colonialism. And the first one, we just literally enslaved the people. And then the second one, we like economically put the folks in debt so we could take all their physical resources. And then the third one, people are worried that we're going to create these nature-based and biodiversity credits, and they're going to come out there and own all the forests and every other kind of thing. And honestly, I think that truly is a big risk. Right? That the people with the money, the people that create these debt instruments, the people that create these structures tend to be the well-resourced nations just carving up the lesser resourced nations. And I think we played that script twice already, and every single time it was truly terrible, like literally like ruined livelihoods. And honestly, there's like a sort of like internalized, you know, like pain even in the winners, that they're not necessarily like processing or recognizing yet, like the winners that like absorbed all the resources. And let's not do that again. Like, I think we did that plenty for the last 500 years.
Okay, so some interesting themes here, and I think picking up on a lot of the conversation this morning in the plenary session, and I hope everybody was there because it was quite insightful and inspiring. So there is resistance, right? So how do we break through that resistance? How do we move from, I think Anthony Bug Levine said, from intention to action? And my colleague David in the panel just before this mentioned moving from a scarcity mindset to one of abundance, which we talk about a lot at ImpactAlpha, but really it applies so much to nature, right? You think about, you know, wind and solar, abundant. You know, nature provides pretty much everything we need if we're not extracting it and degrading it and just not valuing it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we kind of break through some of that, some of those paradigms of thinking.
Thank you. So I think in my high school economy class, the very first term was scarcity. That was the first term. So when we are taught about this economic system built on scarcity, we're all competing for these finite resources, and we're all making decisions from our egos. And I think the other wise paradigm that has been around for millennia is the unity paradigm that starts from a collective abundance, and so that keyword, collective. And so one of the things that Tom mentioned, we are overfunding individual vehicles instead of collective mobility. That is part of, you know, the materialization of that kind of thinking. So I think we need to move from a separation paradigm that separates the feminine from the masculine, that separates the global north from the global south, that separates so many realms, so many worlds, the financial world from the real asset world. All of those paradigms, I think we need to go into a unity paradigm, because I don't know if this was Gandhi who said that there's not enough, there's never enough in the world. I mean, there is enough for everyone's needs, but there is never enough for everyone's greed or as an individual's greed. So there is enough. We don't need to compete all the time. Maybe it looks too rosy to think that we need to be on an eco paradigm all the time, but maybe if we would just 50-50, instead of 95% in the ego and 5% in the eco, maybe just a split, just a balance would be amazing. And I think that really shows us that the unity paradigm has been around for a long time. We need to learn from it because, human beings, we're not extractive by design. We are extractive in a very recent model. And we do know how to be architects of abundance. And if you guys want to watch Laila Jun's TED Talk, she's amazing in explaining how we as humans don't have to be the virus of the planet or the extractors of the planet, or we don't need to be taken out of ecosystems. We can be responsible stewards, and we can be a keystone species.
Yeah. She says it all. I will say, at Nature Tech Collective, we force ourselves to think of the first and second horizon. Just because, we were talking about this earlier. Our bet is that the world of nature and nature tech, just if you are the most selfish investor in the world, you care about nothing, right? Next to, I would say, I guess, AI, which is obviously hockey stick. Nature will go hockey stick. If we think about it, they talk about how 55% of global GDP is tied to nature. Let's be real, it's 100%. No nature, no GDP, right? Obvious, okay. So we know every company has either impacts on or is impacted by, obviously, let alone every human being. So who's gonna address all that? Who's gonna help all these firms? And I met many of them at Bloom. And the good news from Bloom and Kali, every company now realizes this. They're getting their heads out of the sand. The CFOs are like, oh snap, I'm Starbucks, I'm not gonna have coffee in 10 years. What am I gonna do? So people are realizing this, which is the good news. The challenge now is moving as quickly from education to action. And so again, going back to the abundance piece and everything you're saying, I think the difference between AI and nature is that AI, it's gonna take off, but we put ourselves a boundary. We said by 2030, we need to preserve 30% of nature. And so that we exist to accelerate as fast as possible. And so there's a huge opportunity here to both think with the sort of, I need to earn my return, but also I wanna make impact happen. And I really encourage anyone in this room to look into this space because, the opportunity is really grand. And that's the good news from Kali.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to potentially unblock things and get folks moving. The first is you can actually start by picking the subset of problems where you can kind of half play by the existing rules. And we do this in our firm all the time. So what I mean by that is we find deep tech which has got way lower ecological footprint, so it gets rid of 99% of the water pollution or 90% of the emissions, so much safer for the environment. But we also find tech where the unit economics are better. And that's what I mean by you can play, you can half play with the system. A bunch of our portfolio companies are doing astoundingly well, but if you go and you ask, the customers of our portfolio companies, 95% of it are buying because the unit economics are better. They could honestly care less about anything else. And as much as I wish they would care about, all the other reasons that we invested in the tech, well, if it means that the market picks up very quickly and they are very quickly picking up a cleaner solution for the world, then I'm fine with the fact that 95% of them, came at it without that intention, right? Like they're buying it just because it's better unit economically, and then they happen to improve the world, while that happens. And the place that I came up with this this thesis was actually kind of a terrible place, because I was helping a company chase down, try to make a more sustainable textile supply chain. And I was basically discovering the reasons why we employ so much child slave labor in textile production. And it's really, if you think about how much it costs to go sew a particular seam. So a t-shirt is a 7-seam sew. And 7 seams, each one of those seams, in terms of the labor cost, is 0.2 cents to do a seam. That means the labor for a t-shirt is 1.4 cents. Now, that's so little to pay. And by the way, the people that sew those sorts of things make about, $30 to $80 a month. So put some stuff in context, right? Anyway, that's how all that math works out. Now, what's cheaper than 1.4 cents? 0 cents. And when you employ child slave labor, it turns out that you can move some of that 1.4 down to 0, and your average delivery cost is lower. Now, that's obviously horrifying. Like, nobody in the supply chain that ordered this stuff was like a big fan of slavery or a big fan of child labor, but they were a big fan of getting better prices for their customers. And because of it, it passed down all the way to the difference between 1.4 versus 0 cents meant we will do child slave labor. And it struck me like, well, if the market is so rapacious for better unit economics that they will literally throw away everything they believe in order to save 1.4 cents, what if we made it so that the cleanest, best tech was also in that spot? Because people would fall over themselves to get the cleanest thing done. Now, sometimes you need to be in these terrible situations in order to go see that there's a seed in there. And like, this is the way that you get it started, because once people start to adopt those clean things that have way better unit economics, it breaks this kind of false, false idea that's been in the market for a long time, which is, oh, if you make your thing cleaner and greener and better for the environment, it's intrinsically going to cost more. Or if you want to be better at business and move those costs down, then it's intrinsically going to be worse for the environment. That's not true 85% of the time. We look at about 1,500 companies a year. So like, I'm going to say about 85% of the time, those two things are fully in alignment. There isn't like a seesaw where you move one up and the other one moves down. So like, that thought needs to be broken because it's mostly not true. And you can go pull out examples where it is true and hold it up and say like, this is why we're never going to look at anything green, but it's fully not true. Now, if we get you into the mix just because you wanted the better unit economics, great. I can then tell you, by the way, your emissions are down by 95%. Your water pollution's down by 99%. And yes, also your OpEx is 2x better. Congratulations, right? But like, this starts to break that idea and they start to reconnect. Like, no, these are not intrinsically against each other. I could be looking for things that are both cheaper and better for the environment. These don't need to be like ahead of CSR compared to the COO, right? Like, this can be in the same thought process. Sorry,
Tom, can you give a couple of examples from your portfolio?
Oh yeah, for example, so the majority, like more than 90% of global water pollution is just 4 industries. It's agriculture, textiles, paper and pulp, oil and gas. And the way that our firm works is we want humanity to become a net positive in nature. Nature to us is air, water, soil, biodiversity. So we stack rank the industries that are doing the most damage in all of those categories. So I told you, the water pollution by volume stack rank for water. We also have a stack rank for what damages hydrology and also a stack rank for particularly damaging pollutants in water. But anyway, long story short, you end up with not like thousands of industries. You end up with 3 or 4 industries at the top of each of these stack ranks that you're going after. Now, for example, in textile dyeing, we invested in, and the way that we invest is through this contract that we call the triad. The triad is a disruptive deep tech, which brings in radically better unit economics paired with radically better environmental economics. So, concrete example, we invested in a textile dyeing machine that has 2.5 to 3x better OpEx. So instead of costing, 28 to 35 cents to go dye a standard length of fabric, costs us 9 to 15 cents. So we're way, way cheaper, way, way better at this thing. But it also reduces the water pollution from multiple metric tons a day to about 2 to 3 ounces a week. So I mean, it would go from one of the very top water polluting industries just to not even on the list anymore. And how does this work? We actually just deliver, we use the absolute minimum amount of water that is required to go deliver the dye into the fabric. So think about more like an inkjet cartridge. Like an inkjet cartridge is not voluminous. It's tiny, but it actually prints, thousands of pages with just a tiny little cartridge, right? Very similarly, our thing is concentrated like that. We deliver with the minimal amount of liquid required, and as soon as that liquid fully dies through the fabric, it goes through an infrared roller, and the tiny bit of water pollution that we had basically evaporates to water vapor. The reason that we even have 2 to 3 ounces of pollution per week is that when you change colors, there's a little bit of dye that's still in the feed tubes, and like we wash out some mils of color in the feed tubes, but that's it. Like that's the whole thing for textile dyeing then.
Do me a favor. When I say nature tech, just think of some sort of technology. What comes to mind? Okay, no, don't say it out. Just think in your mind. Think. Okay, now raise your hand if you thought of a cow. Interesting. Okay. So when we define nature tech, we go very broad. Nature tech includes traditional ecological knowledge. It also includes ecosystem service derived by amazing technologies like the cow. So 2 examples. One is in Costa Rica right now, there are projects that are using the cow as a basis for bringing back biodiversity to degraded pasturelands. Frankly, bringing the degraded pasturelands back to much healthier soils and all the rest. Why? Because a cow is meant to do that. It was meant to eat, so mowing down the grasses, and then poop, right? And the poop is actually fertilizer. And if you do it in the right way through rotational grazing and some, yes, we could add some really cool Fitbits and stuff like that, you could actually create projects that have an entire capital stack. Carbon credits, biodiversity credits, the cows themselves, and other ecosystem services. One example. And then the cows as inspiration. One of the entrepreneurs in our community, he's an Indian entrepreneur who, inspired by the gut of a cow, created this 7-chamber kind of Krebs cycle system that is no electricity, no chemicals, low electricity, and takes the blackest of waters and then makes it into water potable enough to use for flowering and all the rest. And the system could be as small as for 5 people or as big as 30,000 person villages. So that's biomimicry, which is another form of tech innovation, right? So there are amazing technologies out there that you just find anywhere. And apropos our conversation on abundance, so much of it is inspired by the way nature works as well.
Okay, so so we're talking about how to shift behavior, how to value some of these things, and Gilad, you mentioned carbon markets and biodiversity credits, and that is one tool that we have to start putting a value on negative and positive externalities. So far with mixed results, but in terms of being a tool to channel capital where it needs to go to good projects that are nature and climate positive, and sort of what I've been picking up from some of the global climate talks and biodiversity talks, like what's happening in Cali, and maybe you can chime in here, is that, there's not the will on the part of the global north and the wealthy countries to actually put the money that's needed to some of these uses in the global south, for mitigation, for adaptation, for biodiversity. So therefore, this other, climate, carbon credits, biodiversity credits are a tool to do that. And I'm curious about your views on that, and yeah, if that's a step in getting to a better way of valuing positive and negative externalities.
No, go for it. Yeah.
So, first of all, you have to admit that the very creation of carbon credits, biodiversity credits, which is an emerging phenomenon, I mean, it's really amazing to think of, the great minds are trying to build innovation in a space that's kind of stuck, right? And unfortunately, in lieu of compliance coming from the States, you see more in Europe. And Europe is fomenting sort of the move of companies, 50,000 companies have to go towards nature-related disclosures because of CSRD. Right? It's becoming the law of the land. So 50,000 companies in Europe will have to disclose their nature-related impacts. And then every company that wants to go in Europe will also have to do it. So there is room for compliance. It's just not enough. We think that biodiversity credits will undoubtedly mostly be much more scientifically rigorous philanthropy. And as long as it stays on the side of CSR, marketing, storytelling, it's just not going to cut it, not in time. And the way to go is we have to move the conversation towards the CFO's door. And again, the good news is that it's happening because it's hard to miss the news. And you could look at big companies, you either call them slow or malevolent, but currently the system is built to be aligned towards earning money. But because of the way it's becoming harder on commodity lines are strained, and it's becoming more and more clear that if they don't do something about it, their business will disappear. That's creating the type of movement where you don't need biodiversity credits to do it. You're seeing innovation happening around supply lines. You're seeing innovations happening around insetting. You're seeing innovation happening around basically climate resilience. So credits are really good either if there is a compliance market like in California or in Europe, or if it's philanthropy that's just more scientifically rigorous, and it's great for areas where the supply line isn't emerging from there. It is not an excuse to destroy the Congo Basin and then buy credits from, boreal forests in Canada. And that's becoming much more clear and adamant.
So I think we're moving into an uninsurable world, and I do believe that biodiversity is everyone's only life insurance. And when you mentioned actually the climate tech, for me, the climate tech is photosynthesis. That is what I believe. So if biodiversity is everyone's only life insurance, who should we be paying the premium for our lives? I believe we should be paying the biodiversity stewards. And the biodiversity stewards for millennia have been, the indigenous communities, the land stewards, basically the rural communities all over the world. And I believe there has to be a way to get money flowing to them, because, what's that axiom that is like energy is not created or destroyed, only transformed? So we have an excess of financial capital. It is in excess, and it has liquidated and come from social capital and natural capital. So when Tom was mentioning enslavement, the most enslaved being has been nature, because we've always paid zero. And so I do believe there is a wisdom behind putting a price on nature, but I do believe it is absolutely necessary that we don't see that as the end. Monetizing and putting a price is not the end. It has to be to value it intrinsically. So what I feel is that we are at the beginning of a bridge. If we don't put a price, it doesn't exist. So we need to put a price so that we are actually acknowledging the existence. And then when we acknowledge existence, how do we walk the way to that bridge or build that bridge collectively from price to value? Because I don't remember who said this, but the cynic knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Well, who was that? Anyway, British, whoever. So, I mean, that's the problem, right? The market's language today is price. We need to talk the market's language. But that should never be the end goal. And so my fear is both neo-colonialism and ecofascism. And neo-colonialism, because now there's a land acquisition strategy behind a ton of sustainability and regenerative branding. And behind that, the real investment thesis is land acquisition and driving the biodiversity stewards out of their lands, or managing it for them, or paying them to manage it as labor. So land acquisition strategies behind those regenerative branding, they always forget social justice, and they always forget that it's an accumulative design. And that is not going to be good. It's going to be this giant game of monopoly, which already is happening in the US, rural lands, and will be happening in the rest of the world. So that is my main fear. Neocolonialism and ecofascism is when you only care about the ecological stuff and you forget about the social justice. And so you drive the divide wider. And so I think we're going to be talking about this there was a homework that they left us in the plenary to do the uncomfortable. So Jen Price and me already knew that that was coming up. And we're going to be doing a workshop tomorrow afternoon about driving climate finance from the comfortable to the transformative. So join us, please, to do the homework that we were left with in the plenary. But I think it's really transformative for us to question the paradigms of pricing and value, to question. So basically, my question to ecological fascism is a phrase from Chico Mendes. He was an Amazonian activist from many decades ago, and he said, ecology without social justice is just gardening. And so we really need to bring the holistic view of social justice to whatever we're doing to the, environmentally. Like the interventions cannot just be environmental. This is existential, and the wound, the social wound, is bleeding. It's so big. We need to do this intervention with a social justice lens, and a land acquisition strategy won't cut it. So those are my main fears from the nature markets. I do believe there is people that are active hope because they're doing the nuanced work of putting the communities at the ownership of their assets, because they are, and like Regen Network and like so many others. And so I think that is a conversation that we need to have.
Yeah, if I could, say even a more challenging thing, which is that I'm pretty skeptical about the carbon markets broadly, just as an approach. Look, within what's happening, there are some people that are doing a better job and folks that are doing a worse job. There was a lot of room for people to do a terrible job, actually, partially because of the approach. And the thing that I think is a better model is the things that we did successfully get out of the industrial system recently. So we got let out of gasoline. That was recent, right? We got rid of DDT. That was recent. We got rid of CFCs. That was recent, right? And the lead of gasoline was literally with the oil company. It was literally with the same counterparties. And we fully got that out of the system now. And the way that we did things, for example, the CFCs, that sort of thing, that was through the Montreal Agreement, where we basically said, hey, the simple rule behind all of these could be summarized as polluter pays. There isn't some third entity, the credits, that can create, gamesmanship around the way that you play that market and all that kind of thing. They don't award a bunch of credits to folks that are already polluting in order to go trade them. Right? No, they were you're polluting, you pay. It's very straightforward. The currency is money. You understand it. Credits, you're still trying to wrap your head around. Credits, you're trying to figure out whether, a ton of carbon should be worth $800 or $100 or $2, right? And that's wild. That's 3 orders of magnitude swing on something that's supposed to hold value. How does anybody invest in a market that has that much range and volatility on the core asset? That's crazy. If a dollar was a penny one day and $10 the next day, you'd be what? How do I transact this thing? It's wild. So I think polluter pays, man. Just get out of here. No excuses. If you're polluting, you pay. Period. And where do we put that money? Yes, we should give it to the folks that are actually doing the critical work. But I would actually push even harder on exactly what we're protecting, because and look, I don't know how to implement either of the two things I'm saying right here. But this is even more challenging, which is I think we need a new category. Because right now we say well, what if we could just value what they're doing? What if we could value the nature-based services? What if we could go value it, in a legal perspective, giving rights to nature, all that sort of thing? These are all the frameworks that we've come up with. But I'm worried about these frameworks, because if you value the nature-based service and then we discover something even more valuable underneath the ground, we will still dig it out. Right? Because the the value of the hydrology here was this, but the value of the cobalt is that. So boom, nature-based service out of here, right? So there's bugs in that system. What I would prefer is a new category called sacred. And I know that sounds wild, but I think it's very easy to explain to people, right? If you're a new parent and you're rolling your 6-month-old in a stroller down the sidewalk and a stranger walked up and said, how much? You'd be like, whoa. That's not even a discussion. That would violate something deeply sacred. We're not even having this discussion. And I think some parts of the natural ecosystem that are the core metabolic things that drive the overall health of the ecosystem need to fall in a new territory called sacred. And I think every human being knows that because they understand the baby on the sidewalk, right? So if you can understand that conceptually, there's no deep concept for you to wrap your head around. Honestly, trading credits is way more complicated than understanding sacredness. And like, why is there not a category for that? Like, literally every human being has a category inside of their own like hearts for it. So there's no reason that we can't take something that literally everybody knows that personally and make it into something that's as real as this fake financial stuff we made. Okay.
Yeah. So I've been in sort of this impact space one way, shape, or form or other for like 15 years. And I found myself to be the most cynical bastard in the entire room. Often it's like I'm the one who's working in the space. Most people, unlike in this space, it's like, you know, a one-day CSR event and everyone's all doe-eyed. We could do all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, no, you can't. Not yet. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate a bit here. And I'm only saying, like, yes, we should have the sacred. Yes, the right people should be paid. But I'm hearing a lot of should. And like, we will get there, ojalá, as they say in Spanish. It's my favorite word in the world. But there needs to be like tomorrow, and then next month, and next year, and onwards until we get there. And so, yes, carbon markets, mostly fucked. But they've done some good stuff. And we can improve, and we can move on that. Biodiversity credits, personal opinion, I'm sure we're being recorded. I shouldn't say this, mostly a distraction. But there are areas where it is important. And if we just move forward on these things while including, basically, the should for me is a common sense coalition. And actually, I see movement there, where basically, yes, we're getting better and more accurate on the data, and it's incredible, the stuff that's coming out on the broad sense of nature tech. In the meantime, probably reduce the fertilizer use. That's probably going to help a lot. You know, things like that, like, to get towards, you know, we just launched this taxonomy, and the category for regen ag isn't regen ag, it's transition towards regen ag, because everything takes a step. And part of the way to make this happen is to sort of bring everyone together. For example, last week, you bring up the mining industry, you bring up oil and gas. They're pretty bad, they're pretty dirty. I don't have to get into the details, you know about this more than I do. However, you speak to some of the mining companies, and they are the most advanced in nature tech, in nature data collection. They know their stuff. And so if we could kind of catalyze them to investments more towards nature tech in whatever capacity and just get it moving forward, then I think we'll be faster on the way towards the sacred, towards the right people being paid. But we just have to get practical and just move forward.
Okay, thank you all. I want to introduce a question from the audience, which gets to one that I had, and we're all, you know, we're nibbling around the edges here, but let's get granular. What does systemic investment look like for climate?
Can I start? Yeah. Okay, so for example, Gilad was just mentioning the regenerative transition. And I think that is at the core of systemic investing. And I believe that because the food system is the largest employer in the world. And so we can use the food system as the poison pill or as the antidote. And I believe food is medicine. And so I think we know better than the industrialized poisoned way. And so I think part of systems investing is understanding, first of all, living systems. And I do believe, like, there is such a, I love the common sense coalition, because for me there's such a lack of common sense in the word decarbonization. Precisely because we are living carbon life forms. And carbon is the molecule of life. What are we saying when we're saying decarbonization? Because it sounds like carbon is like this enemy that we need to get rid of in that word. And so for people that don't know how the biosphere works, that word sounds like carbon is the devil or the bad guy, when just the molecule of life. So for me, that's what's so scary about the lack of understanding of living systems and the lack of ecological intelligence. Ecological intelligence should be the basis, the fundamentals of any living systems transformation and any living systems investment. And so I never leave out the word living from systems, because sometimes when you talk about systems, you might think of software. So for me, it's really important that we identify living systems as the system of life. And so I think part of the investment thesis is like, fundamentally, we need ecological intelligence. We need to understand the metabolization of climate through not just carbon, but the water cycle that is indivisible from carbon, biodiversity, and soil. And so even the oceans are affected by what goes on in the soil, right? Because they receive all the runoff. So even if we want to save oceans, we need to change how we use land. And so for me, systems change investment, really, I really admire Savory. He's also one of my teachers. And I think he said, Alan Savory said, that the problem is management. So if we align the human management to ecological design, we're basically, that's the systems level investment thesis in a nutshell. In Mexico, we've seen it manifest. So we come, imagine, to like this coffee cooperative, and so we're used to seeing coffee cooperatives all around in the past 2 decades of impact investing, right? So we only hear single commodity cooperatives. We only hear single commodity companies. If we have a systems change lens, let's talk about polycultures. Let's talk about the agroforestry system that hosts, yes, the coffee, but it's shaded by the fruit trees. And yes, there is living organisms around it, and yes, there is precious woods, and yes, there is walnuts and vanilla and cinnamon and chiles and so much. You know, when I go into some agroforestry places in Mexico, you have so much, and they haven't even monetized their carbon capture. So I think the systems change has to start with this fundamental understanding of the ecosphere, and then build on top of that a diversification so that we're not funding single commodities or supply chain, but rather full flourishing ecosystems, vibrant ecosystems. So I think Stuart and me used to be we are in the Regenerative Communities Network, and I think John Fullerton or somebody else said that the unit of regeneration is not the company or the investment or the transaction, it is the bioregion. So if we're doing living systems transformation, yes, we have to go local, and Amy actually is the author of Local Vesting that I read in my first SOCAP. Thank you, Amy. So I think back to living systems transformation, the other thing is size. We are over-obsessed with scale, speed, and exponentiality. And exponential growth in nature only appears in cancer. Natural growth that is healthy has a limit of growth and then a maturity. We need to learn to go into maturity and stop obsessing about scale and exponentiality that is unnatural and unhealthy. And so we need to do right size, and we need to learn from balance.
I just would like to jump in here. We talked about this on our prep call. At Climate Week, Bertrand Badre, if I'm saying that right, from Blue Lake and Orange, and I believe former IMF, there's a lot of talk about how do we move from billions to trillions that we need for climate finance around the world. And he said, well, maybe we need to move from trillions to millions, because a lot of places can't absorb the billions, and certainly not the trillions, like a lot of the smaller projects, so they kind of get left out. There are ways to aggregate and pool them maybe, but we have to also think about how to fund those very important smaller projects and where that fits into the overall investment landscape.
Yeah, actually, I want to build on that as well, which is everybody's obsessed with scale in terms of geographic scale and money and all that kind of thing. But I think the more important scale is time. Like most of the stuff that we scale, like it's like a flash in the pan. It's like zooms up like that, a bunch of people bail out and like get all their money back or 10 times their money back, and then thing like flames to the ground in another 5 years. And you're like, oh, what was that all about then? right? Like nothing in nature we would consider successful if it like got huge for like 2 years and flamed out in 5 years, right? Like wasn't Facebook the most important site in the world 6 years ago? It's garbage now, literal garbage. Wasn't Twitter something like a couple years ago? Nope, literal garbage now, right? So like as much as like a bunch of people, like including people with their super yachts in this harbor, like made their money off of those things, like it was literal garbage. I mean, like no one will give a shit in 20 years about Facebook or Twitter. It's just not a thing. It doesn't exist in any scale and time. And the scale and time is the thing that ultimately matters, right? Like the things that make us up are things that lasted with scale and time. The DNA inside of us was billions of years of effort. That's the stuff that scales in time. And like if we can actually spend a bit more time understanding, and actually my normal answer to the question is kind of along this line, which is that like, well, you were saying before, 50%, but it's actually 100% comes from nature. Well, it's obvious 100% comes from nature because everything from the economy is either mined or grown. So it means it literally came directly from nature, duh. I mean, look at everything around you. It's all mined or grown. That means we literally grabbed it from nature. Even like the online services we run on server racks that were mined and grown, period. It's 100% physical economy, guys. Even though I worked in digital stuff forever, like this is 100% physical economy, period. And if you want to understand where the wealth comes from, you need to understand the verbs that created that wealth. Because all these things that were mined and grown didn't like suddenly like appear magically in all the forms that we wanted instantly. No, they developed through these metabolic processes. Slow geologic metabolic processes, faster life-driven metabolic processes. And if we want to be actually good at interfacing with life, we also need to go treat it like the verb that it is, right? When you treat life like a noun, then a forest stand basically becomes board feet. But if you understand a forest to be a verb, you understand that the fundamental wealth that comes from a forest comes because the waters are healthy, the air is healthy, and the biodiversity is healthy around it. If that's all in place, this is going to constantly be generating amazing resources for us. If we understand it as the verb and we strengthen the verbs that make it strong, then we get to participate in the wealth of nature, as opposed to when we treat it as a noun, then it just becomes something that we clear cut for board feet. And this is the major shift. Like we need to move to an economy systemically that understands that life itself is a verb, including our own, and stops treating all economic trading as scarcity around nouns. And this is fully the wrong mental frame at the most foundational levels of economic thinking. So we need like a pretty big reboot, but I have like a longer talk. It's like an hour where I like slowly walk through the next 200 years of how we do it. Trying to be more practical, because I don't think it happens tomorrow. I really think that like we've been brainwashed into something that will take centuries to unbrainwash. Just like if you talk to the people that did slavery in the Roman times, they literally thought slavery was just, right? It took hundreds of years for them to get out of it. I don't know, I'm not really sure that the American South is still totally over slavery yet. Because they're like, oh, the Confederate flag, we still need that, it's tradition. And it's like, I'm pretty sure that's slavery. Right? So like, we're not even through the 200 years of getting over that here. So like, trust me, it will take hundreds of years to untangle the level of stupidity at the current foundation of economics.
Let's hope we have that much time. I know we're running a little bit short here. So I have a question from the audience I'd like to ask, and then I'd like for each of you to talk about, maybe highlight one of the sessions that you're particularly excited about that's coming up that you curated. But from the audience, and this is true, everything we're talking about here is like not news to any, indigenous person who has lived this way for years and has that ancestral tradition. So can you each talk about your work with tribal communities?
Okay. Yeah. I just want to quickly just say the last question, because I thought it was a really fantastic question. Just from my perspective, the way I would look at systemic investing into climate, nature, and all the rest is mapping out the opportunities, mapping out where the money's going to, and trying to focus on the most tractable or the least invested in. In the case, a live example I'm really excited about is around nature insurance. We don't have enough insurance product to nature, and that's preventing a lot of the nature finance gap for closing. There's a project that's being built by colleagues of ours around reducing nitrogen in the Mississippi Delta. And the only way this is happening is because a really big nonprofit foundation is stepping in and backstopping the insurance with $1 million, which is like nothing for them. And they're probably not even going to spend it. But the fact that they put it in, that's systemic investing. That's catalytic capital. There's a lot of those examples, and I'd encourage to look at those kind of angles. Okay. As for the last question, in my previous life, I was a co-founder of an impact blockchain, and we started focusing on democratizing impact investing. The SEC told us to stop doing that, and so we moved to the world of nature credits, and then very quickly started swimming up the river and had an opportunity to work with the Shipibo people in Peru on an indigenous-led Red Plus project, which was going to be 800,000 hectares. And the Shipibo people, it's very much a confederation. There's like dozens of villages. So we had to send one of the leaders to basically canoe for days and get consent and agreements. It was an amazing project. And the entire time, the guy's calling us back, said, listen, 3 days from now, the Mennonites are coming and they're gonna just cut down the logs unless we give them some money. And then the investors are like, I don't trust these people. I don't know. I need some like documents. And it's like, no. You got to understand. The palm oil farmers, they're going to build a soccer field. This shit is gone. And we're like, so we started putting money of our own just to stave it off. And that is where you get to this notion of just how ridiculous it gets. And so with our present work, and that project is still moving forward, but it's hard. What I'm really most bullish about in terms of how we bring in frontline communities into the space. So some of you may have heard of the term or the sentence, software is eating the world, right? It probably came from somewhere around this city. Software eats the world because everyone could be a developer. Like it used to be just a bunch of like theoretical mathematicians and then da-da-da-da-da, now everyone's a developer and boom. We're still stuck in that theoretical mathematician part of nature, right? We're sending like conservation biologists from UC Berkeley or University of Iowa all the way down to the Amazonian headwaters to do collection of nature data. No wonder we're not moving forward. Where it gets really exciting and the opportunity lies in terms of bringing equity, social equity into the space of nature is that because of the deflationary nature of tech, the sensors are getting cheaper, it's easier to maintain, the camera traps, anyone can collect data with an app. You're basically able to build a global core of nature engineers. And who's better to be in the Amazonian headwaters collecting nature data or maintaining camera traps than the frontline communities, the indigenous peoples who are already there. And so a lot more of our members are building tools that enable this and are now starting to build projects that are actually recruiting and allowing, here's another remuneration path towards doing it. And you're seeing projects, again, in Costa Rica with the Replanet and Mosaic Earth. Peru, a big nature credits project in Peru is about to build strategies for bringing in local peoples, and you'll see this pop up a lot. And that's something we're really, really excited about.
So in Mexico, there's a ton of indigenous peoples, and basically in our work, we are trying to be a bridge between the finance world and biodiversity thriving. And so we've been very, very fortunate to be learning from so many indigenous leaders. So one in particular that I will mention is the Mazahua community in Michoacán. Actually, when Stuart and I were there, there was a Regenerative Communities Network retreat that we co-hosted back in 2019, and people from all over the world came, Nepal, Canada, Switzerland, Brazil, you name it, and we were greeted by the Mazahua, and the Mazahua have that name because they are the stewards of the corn. And so when you bite into that tortilla, they were saying, it's like having a conversation with our land. It is like you're having an intergenerational conversation of all the stewarding of these seeds, that the seed is like such a unit of life, that we've been stewarding intergenerationally and grown into this perfection, you know? I mean, this beauty, it's art, it's mostly art, what they're doing in corn. So I have really trying to be a student of their wisdom, because I believe their knowledge has been radically undervalued, and I believe they are holders of so much wisdom. And so what we are trying to do in Regenera Ventures, we're trying to fund and partner for the regenerative transition in rural Mexico. So mostly we want to steward local leadership and help them, give them self-liquidating inequity so they can own their own transformation and they can be their stewards. So I'm like reversing technical assistance. Usually technical assistance comes top down in a way that some organization in the global north funds something that the land stewards have to learn, right? The campesinos or the farmers have to learn whatever comes up. And this is a reverse. We're doing investor learning journeys so that we go and we learn from them. And basically they are, stewards of really transgenerational wisdom that we'll need to learn from. And just tapping into one previous question, Tom was calling the sacred as this new category. And at the beginning of this year, we were in the Oxford Impact Investing course debating. There was an Oxford debate if putting a price on nature was ethical or the way to go for impact investing or not. And we came up with like the question of, do we need to sell our mother in order to save her? And so when you put it as our mother, it touches into that sacredness that Tom was mentioning of your kid, right? So I think that sacred category, I want to embrace it, Tom, and I think we all know the sacred. We are all indigenous to Earth. We just need to remember. We need to remember, and we need to be very reconciliatory. And so it's not just regeneration, the task of our generation, it is also reconciliation.